Good evening, friends. It's so good to see you here. I'm Rabbi Sarah Berman. I'm the Director of Jewish Culture and Programming here at Central. I'm so sorry I missed our first session. I promise not to do it again. Tonight, we are back for our second in our series of 4 programs with the Israel Policy Forum. It feels very different tonight because it is just our cohorts who are here. So we are going to be really focused on listening, learning, questioning, and then shifting to our cohort spaces for some really frank conversation again. So I'm really glad that all of you are here, that you are back or here for the first time, and I'm delighted to learn with you tonight. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Rosa Snyder. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for Israel Policy Forum. We're so excited to be partnering with Central. We love partnering with them on lots of programs. So I'm going to welcome up our speaker for the night. Rachel Brandenburg is Israel Policy Forum's Washington Managing Director and Senior Fellow. She comes to Israel Policy Forum with over a decade of experience at the State Department, the Department of Defense, the U.S. House of Representatives, think tank community, and the private sector. So she has a lot of experience. Welcome to the stage.
Thank you. Thanks, Rosa. Thanks, Rabbi Berman. And thank you all for coming tonight. I can see a lot of light, so if you see me squinting, it's just because I'm trying to see you. I know many of you, if not all of you, were here last week, and we are all folks who are sort of following events in Israel and probably around Israel's neighborhood. So I don't want to repeat anything that you've talked about or you're following. I just thought I would offer a few minutes of sort of framing remarks, and then really this is your time to ask questions, and I hope we can have a robust discussion about whatever relevant, ideally, topics you want to discuss. So if you allow me, I have some notes to sort of keep myself focused, but I promise I won't read from notes for the Q&A. So first, as we all know, the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas that President Biden negotiated with the help of President Trump and Special Envoy Witkoff broke down in mid-March, and Israel resumed airstrikes on Gaza on March 18th and more recently ground operations. Earlier today, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that the IDF is in the process of seizing territory and occupying an additional corridor, the Morag corridor, and it increasingly looks like Israel is preparing to militarily reoccupy at least parts of Gaza with an absence of real discussion over alternatives or plans for a better way forward. Although concurrently the US is still trying to negotiate a ceasefire and hostage release deal, there doesn't seem to be much progress, at least publicly. And it's unclear to me whether Prime Minister Netanyahu and his current government really want a reason to end the war. In going back to military operations, we've seen over the past couple weeks that Israel is less restrained than it had been since probably the initial few months after October 7th. There's very little coordination between civilians, humanitarian infrastructure or aid workers, and the IDF, which is leading to more civilian casualties, particularly over the past few days of humanitarian aid workers. Israel is withholding humanitarian aid, and many folks at different levels don't really see an end in sight unless the US and Qatar and Egypt and Israel can negotiate a ceasefire and hostage deal. From the Israeli leadership perspective, military pressure on Hamas is the only way to get them to compromise on their position, and there's nobody trying to stop them from fighting. There seems to be less priority on getting hostages home than decimating Hamas. Meanwhile, the Israeli public continues to protest in support of prioritizing bringing hostages home over fighting and against Netanyahu's dismissal of Shin Bet chief Ronan Bar. Israel has yet to produce any real implementable plan for what happens once the fighting ends, or give much credence to proposals that others have produced, to include the Arab states about a month or so ago, and have also established a military presence in Syria and Lebanon along its borders, which need more manpower to sustain. I'm happy to talk about Syria, Lebanon, or sort of other parts of the region when we get to Q&A. On many levels, I look at this and I'm sort of thrown by deja vu, a return to where we were prior to the January ceasefire, but worse, and it feels like a lot is stuck. There are, however, a few noteworthy developments that I am watching. One is within Gaza. Over the past week, we've seen Palestinians in Gaza come out and protest against Hamas and against the war. To protest against the war doesn't seem that surprising, but to protest against Hamas does. It suggests that either people are so fed up with Hamas rule and manipulation that they are willing to risk their lives even more than their lives are already at risk for it, or that Hamas's power and control have diminished such that people are more able and less afraid to come out and protest against them. Or perhaps more likely, some of both. We have already seen reports of Hamas enacting revenge on some of the protesters, including brutally killing at least a few of them. But how resilient the protests are and how much Hamas tries or is able to crush them is yet to be seen. And lastly, but importantly, and something that I sort of watch more closely from DC, is what's happening within the United States, and perhaps more accurately, among US leadership. We have a fairly incoherent and at times unpredictable and contradictory approach to Israel and the Middle East, among elsewhere in the world, that doesn't seem to be helping move negotiations or conversations about post-war along in what I would consider a constructive direction. Over the past 3 months, we've seen President Trump go from the war must end before I take office, which it did temporarily, to his Gaza Riviera proposal that included transferring Palestinians out of Gaza and an offer for the United States to rebuild Gaza, to then advocating for a long-term ceasefire, to saying most recently and genuinely, never mind. Prime Minister Netanyahu can do whatever he wants in Gaza, he can fight, he cannot, I don't care. Special Envoy Witkoff seems to be trying to pursue negotiations, and I do genuinely believe that they want to get the hostages out and be able to say that they got the hostages home. But it's unclear to me at this point what pressure the US is putting on Netanyahu beyond the sheer fear of what Trump might do tomorrow to achieve either a ceasefire or hostage release. Beyond a ceasefire, I also don't see the Trump administration particularly interested in the details of what happens when the war ends. They tried to pass the burden of responsibility to the Arab states, but the plan that the Arab states put together, although a good start, was lacking on many levels and didn't seem to advance the ball much. Whereas the United States has traditionally played the role of both lead negotiator in this arena and a check on some of the parties' worst instincts, the US seems to be providing no check right now, and instead letting everyone's worst instincts lead the way. Israel seems to be taking full advantage of this to pursue this government's priorities in Gaza and the West Bank, as well as internally. At the same time, Israel has been advocating strongly for the US to support Iran, to support a strike, a military strike on Iran's nuclear program, which the US has thus far resisted, insofar as we can tell. Coming into office, President Trump was pretty clear that he wanted wars to end and didn't want to get into a war with anyone, nonetheless Iran. He's recently proposed direct negotiations, and just yesterday or today, Iran counter-proposed indirect negotiations, which the president and his advisors say they're considering. So it still seems that Trump is preferencing diplomacy first. But simultaneously, the US has started a military campaign against the Houthis in Yemen and moved 2 aircraft carriers from elsewhere in the world to the Middle East. Both of these a signal to Iran that the US means business when it threatens war, if Iran will not compromise on its nuclear program. We'll need to see whether this administration is disciplined enough to sustain a limited military campaign against the Houthis and flex its muscle in ways that are meaningful militarily without throwing a knockout punch of joining Israel in a strike against Iran. So this is a lot of doom and gloom, but I will leave you with one glimmer of hope. It's not near term necessarily, but perhaps in the medium term, and for better or worse, with these still being very early days of this administration, I think there's still time. Despite the incredible and unfortunate and complex challenges that I've just described and the many others in the region, and the seemingly stuck position I see the situation in Gaza right now, I do still think that President Trump would like to expand the Abraham Accords, achieve Saudi-Israel normalization, and bring to fruition what he has called the deal of the century. I truly think he wants a Nobel Peace Prize and sees this as the way to get there. We've heard him talk about it, we've heard Special Envoy Witkoff talk about it repeatedly, and as recently as the past week. I'm not sure they fully appreciate how much more difficult recent US and Israeli actions make such a deal. But we also know that Trump has a tendency to change his mind, believes that much can be accomplished through backroom deals, and can make an about-face at any moment. So I do still maintain a little hope that these things could lead us to see something change and to see a shift in the direction within President Trump's administration. In my opinion, Saudi-Israel normalization and Israel's further diplomatic and economic integration into the region remains the best option for long-term Israeli security and sustainability. To even begin down this path, however, a few things need to happen. The war in Gaza needs to end. For that to happen, hostages need to be released. I won't repeat all the challenges I just talked through about how to even get there, which is difficult. And as the Saudis have been saying all along, but even more strongly over the past 2 months, they need to have, as part of any negotiation and certainly any part of a deal, a credible path toward a Palestinian state. This is a piece that seems particularly difficult for this Israeli government, but governments change and elections will come, whether sooner or later. Their Saudi leadership has its own interests in a secure, stable region, given its ambitious but very much priority objectives with respect to something they call Vision 2030, sort of an internal social reform and prosperity plan, and the Crown Prince's own domestic politics. They and others in the Gulf have to contend with an Arab street that has been reawakened by the war in Gaza over the past year and a half. A whole generation of young folks who didn't think about Palestinian issues for most of their upbringing have now spent almost 18 months watching media coverage of death and destruction in Gaza and want to see their leadership do something about it. So the Crown Prince needs to be able to show that if he is to normalize relations with Israel, he's delivered something on the Palestinian front. Lastly, for Saudi Arabia, the real prize in all of this is not normalization with Israel, but concluding a defense treaty with the United States. They're unlikely to settle for much less than a treaty, which would need to be ratified by Congress from everything that they've said so far. So to get any deal through Congress will require an additional challenging step for the Trump administration. None of these things are easy. All of them will take time. But as I mentioned, we're barely 3 months into this administration. So for better or worse, they have some time to try and shift directions and see if they can bring what is now a very dismal and challenging situation to a better place. I will stop there and happy to take any questions that folks have. I see on the right. Oh, sorry.
Can I get my facilitator? You want to take this aisle? I'll take the other one. So the hands again. Going to come right over here. And then we call you the next one.
Hi, thanks for that. I have 2 questions that are not related to each other. One is, you did not mention the Palestinian Authority at all in your little kind of update. And so I'm curious what's happening with the Palestinian Authority these days, particularly in light of the protests by Palestinians in Gaza against Hamas. And the second question has to do with the Rafah border crossing into Gaza, because there's all kinds of discussion about how there's no aid coming in through Israel. And I'm curious if there's any aid coming in through the Egyptian border into Gaza right now.
So thank you. I'll start with the second one. In the recent weeks since the fighting has started, from everything we are seeing, including some of our colleagues in Israel who work much more closely with this, there is no aid going into Gaza right now. There was a lot of aid going into Gaza during the ceasefire period. So it's not as if aid stopped and suddenly there is no food. The best estimates are there is about 2 weeks of supplies remaining at this point.
Because the Egypt border is closed?
I think all border crossings are closed, to include Egypt, but I would have to verify that. And your first question on the PA. Yeah, and we came out with a report about a month ago focused on sort of the whole litany of reforms that the PA needs to undertake. They are an entity that is not capable of governing in the way that needs to be the case in the West Bank or in Gaza. And there's a whole slew of things that could be done in the near term to improve that. Reforms that they need to take, reforms that the U.S. could help with, that Israel could help with. We are also in a situation where the U.S. has effectively cut all funding, all foreign assistance funding, which included a number of projects in the West Bank and some of the aid, humanitarian and just sort of training and water and agriculture with Israel as well, some of the joint research efforts. And Israeli actions in the West Bank are making stability in the West Bank, including for the PA, that much more difficult. I think one of the successes that we have seen so far remains the Palestinian Authority security forces and the role of the U.S. security coordinator in there, but that only applies to the West Bank right now. So certainly a very challenging situation for reasons unrelated to Gaza. Nonetheless, the sort of idea that the PA could take over Gaza and that one day should, as I think should be a part of an administration in Gaza. But there's a long way to go, and we would need to see very incremental steps to get there.
Hello. Thanks for your remarks. Something that you said I thought was very telling. You said that the Trump administration wants to be able to say that they brought the hostages home. You didn't say that they want to bring the hostages home. And so I actually wonder how this applies to, for example, like the Iran issue. You mentioned the deal of the century, for example. I'm worried that the administration might make a deal with Iran so that they can say they made a deal with Iran, even if that deal is potentially even worse than the previous deal with Iran. So I'm curious what you think about this. Like, what are they actually optimizing for when they're doing these negotiations? And could it result in potentially things getting even worse?
I also worry about that. And I think the interests and sort of the relationship with bringing hostages home and Iran are perhaps different. I do think for a number of reasons, President Trump seems genuinely concerned for the hostages. I do think they genuinely would like to bring hostages home. I also think, and we've seen in so many forums, he is relatively obsessed with winning and being able to show and say that he was able to achieve what no one before has done. So I do think there's a dynamic of reaching the ceasefire. You know, he has taken full credit for it and said, President Biden couldn't do this, only I could. I absolutely think that he and his impending presidency had a role to play in getting that deal over the finish line. I don't think it's accurate to say he was solely responsible for it. But we've seen this in a number of arenas. So I think in the case of a ceasefire and a hostage deal, it's a bit of both. I do think there is an understanding that you have to get a ceasefire to move forward with other priorities in the region. Whether he came to on Iran, I think whether the president came to on his own, or certainly some of his cabinet and close national security advisors have a very hawkish view of Iran. And so whether it's their advice or his own perspective or the Israelis' perspective that have reinforced for him that Iran should not be allowed to get a nuclear weapon, that seems to be a focus right now. And there, I think it's to genuinely prevent that from happening more than be able to say that he did it. But the direct negotiations with Iran, to me, seem like a dynamic of him being able to say, I was the one to directly negotiate, and I was the first one to directly negotiate. So there, too, I think it's a bit of both. What I worry about is there doesn't seem to be the expertise in his administration to deal with the very complex and technical and difficult elements of a negotiation with Iran. Different from a hostage and ceasefire deal. There, I think most of the details have been worked out. It's just a matter of getting the parties to agree to them. Iran is a whole other set of issues and technicalities and really kind of make or break issues that I have yet to see evidence he and his administration have an understanding of how to get us to a good deal.
So you said a few minutes ago that normalization can only occur, at least from the Saudi point of view, if there was some plan for a Palestinian state and the expression two-state solution is like almost illegal now under this current government, which makes people think that the only way out is a change in the Israeli government, and we know elections are not mandated until 2027, in the wrong decade.
It's been a long day.
But in a really great class that we've been taking on Wednesdays here, we were discussing both the Attorney General situation and the Shin Bet situation. The current status of the Attorney General situation has the potential, does it not, to bring down the government? What are the chances of that happening given the continued demonstrations, the Saturday night demonstrations and all of that?
Yeah, I think, so I agree that this government is unlikely to be able to give the Saudis what they need to move forward with a deal. I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility that Prime Minister Netanyahu would be willing to give some lip service to that. I think if we recall, he used to pride himself on being the one who brought Israel into the rest of the world and created all these diplomatic deals. This was a legacy that I think, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago, he would have preferred to hang his hat on than what has been happening since. So if there is a different government that gives him a bit more latitude, I would be surprised, but I wouldn't be shocked that he is able to do that. The chances of the government falling, there are any number of issues that could get us there. He also has a tremendous ability to preserve his political standing and preference actions that do that over nearly anything else. So someone I was talking with recently was sort of saying it's by the minute. Prime Minister Netanyahu decides by the minute what he is going to, sort of which way is he going to go, and often for the sake of his own political standing, which gives me less hope that the government would fall as long as he is able to kind of continue maneuvering. And right now, I don't see almost anything that prevents him from sort of maneuvering as he may. And right now, our own country provides sort of an example of how to politicize professional government or eliminate checks on one's power in a way that I think works to the advantage of those who want to mimic it.
Hi, I wanted to ask about Syria and Israel's objectives. It seems like the Europeans, at least, are interested in bringing al-Sharat's administration into the fold and trying to de-escalate with the Kurds and the Druze. And Israel is not as interested in stabilizing the new regime. So where do you see it going? What do you think Israel's objectives and interests are in the instability that still continues in Syria?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's one that I find fascinating, quite challenging. So forgive me if I go in lots of different directions, because I think there are quite a few different dynamics at play. For one, Israel looks around its borders and wants to do everything possible to prevent another October 7th. They were caught off guard. They didn't have what they needed with respect to border defense. And whereas the Syrian border has been very quiet for a very long time, there is a fear of the fear of we don't know what we don't know, and these are new people in power. They had kind of figured out the rules of the game with the Assad regime, even with the Iranian-backed militia. They could strike certain things, they couldn't strike other things. They had figured out the rules of the game with Russia. Over the past, 14 years since the revolution, and then since ISIS came in, the past 10 years, they've kind of figured out how to maneuver. It was certainly not the best case scenario, but they felt like they were managing from a security perspective. With Ashara coming in, it's a whole new ballgame. They don't really know the leader. He seems to be saying the right thing, but in most Israeli press, you'll see him called al-Jolani, not Ashara. And anyone you talk to will first say, well, remember what his nom de guerre was. Remember who he is and where he comes from. And whereas you talk to some security professionals who will say, we should be verifying, but we should also be giving it a chance. I think what we're seeing is they're not really giving it a chance. So there's kind of the genuine security fear and wanting to protect their own borders. I think there's also a much bigger geopolitical game at play, where partially because Israel sort of knew how to deal with Russia, they have better relations with Russia than with Turkey. There's a camp that would prefer to see Russia as sort of the global power in Syria and not Turkey. Even the strikes that we saw today or yesterday on an air base called T4, where reports have been that Turkey is trying to create that base in Syria as a sort of Turkey-managed drone base. And Israel struck areas around that today. So I think Israel is trying to create a situation where Syria is weak enough that someone needs to come back in to help reassert control, and they'd prefer that that someone be Russia than Turkey, because they really don't want Turkey to be their neighbor, and relations between Israel and Turkey are probably about as bad as they've been. So they're kind of getting involved in this geopolitical game. And whereas this is an area where traditionally the US would be playing a more active role, we don't really see the US trying to push any of the parties in a particular direction. I did see today, interestingly, Saudi Arabia is trying to facilitate a conversation. No, Saudi? I think it was Saudi who's trying to facilitate a conversation quietly between Syrians and Israelis. So there's sort of, the Ashar regime has not picked their bigger ally. They've met with all of them. His first diplomatic visit was to Riyadh, not to Turkey, despite the sense that Turkey is sort of his biggest supporter. And they seem to me to be trying to move things in a positive direction for the sake of Syria. But at the same time, and in this I completely understand Israel's fears, Syria has so long to go before it can be a stable, consolidated, governed state again. So I don't see a lot of strategic patience.
Rachel, can you kind of play out, this is my question, actually.
Sure.
Can you play out the different possibilities for Gaza, the quote-unquote day after, assuming that Prime Minister Netanyahu keeps his coalition and is able to keep making decisions consistent with what has brought us to now, and then with the possibility of new elections in Israel and whatever direction that may go, either a different coalition for him or an entirely new governing coalition. What do you think are the real possibilities for Gaza a year from now, 5 years from now? How might that play out?
In some respects, 5 years from now feels harder than 1 year from now. I think any progress toward a sustainable ceasefire that does not involve Israeli military occupation is really difficult to achieve with this Israeli government. We saw Ben-Gvir leave the coalition when Prime Minister Netanyahu reached the ceasefire in January and said, I'll come back in only if you don't move to phase 2. And Smotrich say, I will stay for now, but leave if you move to phase 2. So he bought himself a little bit of wiggle room with the addition of Gideon Sa'ar, who's now foreign minister. But I don't see a lot of opportunity with this coalition to truly distance Israel from war in Gaza. There also, I do think you need someone other than Israel who's willing to take leadership with respect to what happens in the day after. We don't see a US particularly interested in helping to figure out a plan to get into the weeds, to figure out the security dynamics, which are going to have to be something other than Hamas, other than the Palestinian Authority, whether internationally paid forces or international sort of coalition of forces, and someone needs to be able to pull those forces together, someone with the political will and with the capabilities. You need civil services. I mean, you have the PA quietly doing things like, well, prior to the ceasefire, without saying that the PA is there. When you have electricity cuts in Gaza, it's the PA who goes in to fix the generators. So there are quite a number of technical capabilities that are not Hamas that exist in Gaza, But you need someone to be able to create the political framework to move these things forward. You also need to have some political horizon for any of the countries we talk about in the Gulf to invest in Gaza. Nobody wants to put money into rebuilding Gaza without knowing that that rebuilding is actually going to survive for more than a couple years until sort of the next round of fighting. And it's unfortunate, but I don't see that able to move forward with this government. If Prime Minister Netanyahu were able to reconstitute a different government, if a different prime minister comes to power, I think that would change. And I think there is a lot of reckoning that needs to be done once Prime Minister Netanyahu is no longer prime minister about sort of where Israel has gotten to and where it can move forward. But you also still have an entire country of very traumatized and re-traumatized and fearful people who have genuine security concerns with the situation in Gaza, with going back to the south, with a government that they don't know if they can trust, with security forces they don't know that they can trust. So there are a lot of layers of challenges that are going to need to be worked on to really constitute any of these external forces that will enable rebuilding in Gaza itself.
Hi there. You briefly mentioned the protests that we're seeing for the first time within Gaza, which feels really significant, but it also feels like there's a lack of coverage. It's unclear like why or what the protests are. And it also feels like this would be the moment that we would see all the college campuses, people in cities, like in the street, like showing their support for this voice. And to my knowledge, we're just not seeing that. What do you make of that, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the coverage, I guess do you mean in the US, in Israel, both? Both. In Israel, I think it depends which outlet you're looking at. There's been a little bit of coverage, but there's also saying actually this is a ruse that Hamas is putting people up to just to make us stop fighting. So I think there's a lot of skepticism. Just like a lot of Israeli media outlets have not been showing sort of the destruction in Gaza for a long time, there's selection bias, right? You can sort of decide what stories are covered. And there tends to be more skepticism, particularly in a scenario where I don't see a lot of political interest in ceasing the fighting. In the US, I think it is, from a media perspective, there's just so much to cover right now. There are so many. It's like, I just keep thinking of bobbleheads, but swivel heads, where like, at least in DC, every day, every hour, there's some other ridiculous thing that you never thought could happen that's happening. And some of it makes the press and some of it doesn't. So even the coverage of what's happening in the region, in any arena in Israel, I feel like has diminished just because there's so much else to talk about. I was even noticing the past week that there's barely any coverage of the fact that the United States is engaged in a military campaign in Yemen. And I think there's just a lack of space and mental bandwidth. On college campuses, my only personal association with campuses right now is I'm a Tufts alum, and one of the students who was sort of rounded up in the past week is a Tufts student, so I've gotten more involved in that conversation as alumni are trying to come together and figure out how do we pressure our alma mater to do more to protect students. So there's a couple dynamics that I would expect are happening, but I can't say I'm talking to college students about this. One is fear. One is sort of a fear of what is happening in the United States right now with respect to freedom of speech. People are getting in trouble in really serious ways for things that they said or wrote or did months ago. I wonder if that's impacting people's willingness to sort of go out and protest now. I also think that's impacting universities' willingness to allow protests to happen right now, because just as students are scared, so are university administrations about funding being cut off, about them being the next target. I mean, I was in a very dystopian conversation last week with among sort of the alumni that I referenced, where one who's a college professor was describing students hiding in academic buildings because they're afraid to walk back to their dorms at night, writing on their arms their personal information, so if they're taken, they can at least sort of have identities, sharing with a trusted somebody, like who's the emergency contact in my family or friends that you should call if I don't come home tomorrow. I mean, these are horrifying things. And I would guess that that's impacting people's desire to protest. I also think because there's less coverage, there's just sort of less understanding of what's happening. I too have wondered, why are more people not applauding this? Why are more people not talking about it? And it's more complicated. It's harder to sort of create a groundswell, and there's just so much else to be surprised about. But those are just my own speculation.
I want to go back to the Palestinian Authority for a minute. In the material we read in anticipation of tonight, so much of the day after is predicated on a strong PA. And you did say that there is a list of reforms and ways of some of the other countries can support the PA. I feel that the current leadership is not up to the task. Who is there? Is there any shining light, any hope that somebody could emerge that could gain the trust and have the confidence to lead these people forward?
So I share that concern. I don't sort of have a single shining light. I've asked this question of a number of folks too, and I think depending on who you talk to and where they're coming from, there are a few different ideas. Each of kind of the external actors who are trying to be involved, whether helpfully or not. The UAE has their person who they think should lead. Saudi Arabia has their person who they think should lead. You'll also talk to Palestinians who say there actually are a lot of young people who would step up if only they were given the opportunity and given the space. So is much going to change with Abu Mazen in power? I think there are real limitations. At some point, he will move on. You know, nature will take its course, but that could take quite a while. So it's a big challenge. There are also things that could be done with respect to payments, with respect to the education system, with respect to civil society, right? Some of the bureaucratic functions that a government is expected to run. Those are some of the things that I think can be done in the near term, even absent sort of one leader, but I absolutely sort of share that concern that there needs to be leadership. In my opinion, we need to see a change of leadership across the board for a lot of these big dynamics to really change.
Is that me? Thanks for indulging a second question. I've actually got a two-part question picking up on the previous two comments. Both about Bibi. So the first is, I was in Israel last week, a couple feet away from Bibi, and he gave this speech, and he talked at some length about the college protests. So I'm curious, like, why is the Prime Minister of Israel interested in what's happening on American college campuses? Like, does it affect the war strategy in any way? Or is it just because it was a conference on anti-Semitism? And then the second question is, we've heard a lot about how there's maybe a need for a change of leadership within Israel, but I've heard less about the need for the change in leadership in Gaza. Like the protests are promising, but why is it that the focus seems to be more on the leadership of Israel needs to change, as opposed to saying that Hamas needs to surrender unconditionally, give up the hostages, and then we can talk about maybe changing the government of Israel?
Yeah, let me start with the first one, and I may come back to you as a reminder on the second one. So before you even said anti-Semitism, I was going to guess that Prime Minister Netanyahu was talking about anti-Semitism with respect to the college protests. And very unfortunately, in my opinion, anti-Semitism is being used, real issues, real anti-Semitism are being used in very political ways. We're seeing this with the Trump administration, in using anti-Semitism as an excuse to sort of curtail freedom of speech and go after universities and round up students, on, basically non-American student citizens who have led protests or said something or written something. And I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is using it in a similar way, not only politically, but sort of fear-mongering. There has been, for the past, I guess, almost a year, maybe year plus, that the protests have been ongoing talk of, well, it's foreign funding that's instigating this. It's Hamas sympathizers. It's Iran. And there probably is foreign funding relating to some of it. But I think it's an easy way to stoke the fear of Jews, and particularly American Jews, about sort of deflect the blame and use, again, in this case, anti-Semitism in ways that are politically convenient. In my opinion, they're not in our interest in the long term. It's actually not helpful to American Jewry to use to politicize anti-Semitism and use it as an excuse to sort of do things that I see are blatantly against sort of American democracy and democratic values. But they're sort of 2 pages from a similar playbook. And Hamas protests, your question was, why are we not seeing more talk of leadership changes in Gaza? Do you mean by Gazans? I mean, that was one of the interesting things to me about the protests we've seen in the past week, is it wasn't just protesting the war, it was actually protesting Hamas. Until recently, we hadn't seen much of this, largely, I would expect, because people are living sort of under siege and under fear, not only of Israeli operations, but also of Hamas. And Hamas still is, they're ruling with an iron thumb. They are, and we have seen this, going after some of the protesters, trying to intimidate people from not protesting, killing some of the protesters and leaving the body at the doorstep of their parents' house as a symbol. We will not stand for this. So it takes a particular amount of courage and or desperation, in my opinion, to still go out in the street and protest, despite sort of the genuine risk to your life from multiple directions in doing so. Should I call on someone?
Thank you. I guess just following up on that last point, between last week and this week, sit here having a conversation about how we could impact or be involved or better understand what's happening in Israel, right? I think we all want to contribute. We all want to support. I agree with the sentiment of the gentleman there. It feels often like we're only speaking of what Israel must do, or the conversation revolves around that, and often not enough about, to your point, Gazans speaking up or the Arab world speaking up. And so I'm just wondering, what conversation we can have to also get the rest of the world more engaged, right? Because I think we all know that we don't get to a day after without that. And so wondering, I guess, what you guys are doing, or even conversations that you can point some of us into the room towards on how we engage the rest of the world and say this isn't only Israel's problem or the Jews' problem. This is the world's problem, and it needs to have a world solution, let's say.
That's a really good question. And a really hard, you're right. It is a complicated conversation, and so much of the world gravitates toward it's Israel's fault. I tend to think about what are the things that the United States can do. And as I think most of us Americans, sort of what are the things that we can call on our leadership to do. And in this respect, to me, sort of advocating for US involvement enough that there's ongoing pressure to reach a ceasefire and bring the hostages home. Not to tie Israel's hands in any way. I don't believe that we should, IPF doesn't believe that we should be conditioning aid. Like, Israel and the United States are important security partners, and we have many shared security interests. We diverge in some ways. But I think if the US stops trying to sort of push toward those near-term goals, it's going to be really, really hard to get there. I also, and I hesitate here because I see the US straying from sort of the democracy and democratic values that I think many of us would prefer. So it's hard to see this administration pushing Israel to uphold some of the democratic values that I think many of us would prefer. But that is, to me, a role for American Jewry to be calling on sort of, this is not what at least I grew up knowing that Israel was founded to be. This is not the United States that I grew up knowing the United States was sort of supposed to be. But those are areas where it requires an admission of sort of things are moving in the wrong direction. This isn't the situation that we'd like, but both countries should be upholding the rule of law, maintaining freedom of speech, not politicizing the judiciary, not politicizing the military. Those are the sorts of values that are maybe things that we can continue putting pressure on both our administration and in some ways echoing the protest movements, right? Supporting the voices of the protesters who are calling for all of these things in Israel. I don't know that that's gonna help get sort of broader international community in a different place, but it to me reflects us standing up for the things that we believe in, even if it's also admitting that the places that we love are going in the wrong direction.
Just going back to the college protests, this is actually something that I'm quite involved in for the counter protest. There's actually a protest right now as we're sitting here at Columbia. So I'm as busy as ever since the 8th with the protest. So it's baffled. Oh, I have my own theories on why they're not protesting or why they're not considering these protests in Gaza, but I just wanted to say that they actually are still going on. They're probably just not making the coverage like they used to.
Thank you. And I mean, thank you for the work that you're doing.
Hi. This is a follow-on question, I think. I am curious. So I was here last week and was very kind of excited and encouraged to hear the speaker, Haissam, I can't remember what his last name is, who spoke from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy.
The Egyptian, right?
The Egyptian American, who sounded to me like a kind of like classic liberal thinker, which is kind of unusual, to be honest, to hear from many people with roots in the Middle East. And I'm now kind of obsessed with him, but I'm curious, well, I guess my question is about the Palestinian diaspora and the Middle East diaspora in this country, where people, Palestinians, there are for sure more people in the Palestinian diaspora than there are Palestinians in Gaza at this point. And many of those people have for generations been exposed to liberal values. And I'm curious where you go as part of the Israel Policy Forum to hear some of the voices, the Palestinian diaspora voices that might reflect more liberal values, or maybe Middle East, like Egyptian values, Middle Eastern values in the diaspora, to hear more liberal values on the subject of this conflict.
It's a really good question, and I am going to use my newbie status with IPF to somewhat deflect that question.
Okay.
I've only been with IPF for about 2 months, and I don't know where we work with diaspora voices. I do know we have some amazing partners who actually live in Ramallah or live in other parts of the West Bank. So on that, we have worked with a sort of handful of partners, and I hope we're able to bring at least the one that I've worked with back, and you can sit and listen to him because he was actually on sort of a tour of the U.S. Last month, and similarly reflects a view that you would think, wow, how this is so refreshing and so different and so pragmatic. I think one of the things that we at IPF are really focused on is, particularly in what is a complicated but deeply emotional conflict for so many communities, including in the diaspora, finding voices that are interested not only in sort of similar things and advancing similar policy objectives, but really advancing a pragmatic objective and elevating the discourse with all the complexity that comes with it and all the challenges that come with it and all the sort of nuanced views that come with it, but also being able to sort of remove yourself from the emotional pain and think about more constructive, pragmatic ways forward. So I'm really glad to hear the speakers last week, or at least one of them who you listened to, sort of reflected that for you. I have not actually had the luxury of hearing him speak, but I think that is kind of the type of perspective that we seek out, and I've seen us able to find in a number of arenas. I just haven't yet engaged with the Palestinian diaspora voices.
All right, we have our last question.
Last but not least. I want to add on to the young man who was talking about the world, because one thing that we don't hear much anymore is the UN. And when I was at the ADL summit, which was going pretty high in its anger, and they had Stefanik, or whatever her name is,
Stefanik, yeah.
who thought she was someone and found out she was no one after she spoke there. But what she basically said was that the Trump administration was going to go after every anti-Semite in the UN and was going to protect Israel, which the members of the UN did not want to do. And what I'm asking is, who is trying to get the UN to be involved in this? And if only, we can look at the UN and say, what have they done, other than UNICEF, I guess? But people talk there, and they have had very big discussions. We haven't heard of one discussion from the UN since October 7th. We've heard only a lack of discussion. And it seems to me that a group like this should be also putting out their whatever they put out, their whatever people, to get this worldview, get it out in the open. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think there are multiple levels of the UN. And the conversations that we tend to hear, I'm used to saying here in Washington, here in New York, where the Security Council sits and all the things, and I heard about those comments that Stefanik made. I did not hear them firsthand, but I listened to some of the clips. I completely agree. There are fundamental challenges with the way the UN conducts business, the amount of time they spend sort of going after Israel. There are also UN agencies that do real and important work on the ground in a lot of conflict zones, to include Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, UNICEF, the humanitarian aid arm, OCHA. There's so many problems with UNRWA, but they do actually provide very sort of basic infrastructure and coordination type functions in Gaza and the West Bank. So sort of, I think about a distinction between the kind of day-to-day folks who are working in the field on operations in many conflict zones and sort of the political headquarters that is the UN. We as IPF, to my knowledge, are not particularly involved in the UN arena. Certainly something we can consider. Is there an education campaign for us in the UN? And should we perhaps be engaged more? It's something that we'll think about. Otherwise, I think it is still groups like the ADL, to some extent the American Jewish Committee, and sort of other Jewish organizations that are doing more advocacy work. We as an organization do less advocacy and more sort of informing and educating, which there is a role, you're right, for informing and educating UN officials or representatives to the UN from different countries, but we're less on the advocacy side of things.
So now is the moment in our evening where we officially thank Rachel. And we're going to transition to the 8th floor, which will be a little easier this week without so many things happening here. So we'll head up to the 1st floor, across the lobby, and then up the elevators to the 8th floor where dinner is waiting for you. And look in the elevator for confirmation of what room your cohort is in. Our rooms are set up very thoughtfully and intentionally, so I hope you'll enjoy the rooms as they are set up for you this week. And enjoy your dinner, and we get some more time with Rachel upstairs. She will float from room to room. Thanks all.